We're going to talk about sockets and how you use them in code, how you write code to talk on networks using sockets. So we're going to talk about the socket interface. This is really important when you want to write code that communicates on the network. So if you're not writing code that communicates on the network, you can not worry about sockets. But once you start writing code, and that's what we're doing now, it has to be able to use this socket interface. The socket interface is the most common way to talk on the internet, to programmatically communicate on the internet through a piece of code. So we're going to learn how to make sockets and how you use them in connections. So sockets are our programming interface to talking on the network. Can be used in many languages. C is probably the first place that you use them, C, C++. We're going to use Python. You can create sockets in Python, and that's what we're using because that's how we're programming on the Raspberry Pi. It's based on a client-server programming model, so it assumes client-server interface. It can be used without client-server, but it assumes client-server. So that's what we're assuming in general, and that's mostly what we're going to be dealing with. So what we'll go through here we'll talk about how you might make a client. So we're going to make a sort of a generic client in Python, right? And so this client is going to talk, it's going to connect to some server, and it's going to request something and get a result back, right? That's all it's going to do. Now, this is just a generic server that we're making, or rather generic client that we're making. You can modify this to be a different type of client, right? But we're just making a generic one, send some arbitrary data. So here's what the outline of the structure of such a piece of code, a code for a client, would look like. First, if you want to make this generic network client, you got to create a socket, okay? So we're going to have a little code that creates a socket. And then once you created the socket, you got to connect the socket to the server, right? So on the server side, there's got to be a socket, and you've got to connect those. Now, so when you create the socket, you're creating it locally on the client. You connect it to the server's socket. Then you send your data. Once you have the connection made, you send your data, which would generally be a request to the server. So you can send your data. Then you wait for some response, right? Some response data. So the server presumably will do something and send you a response. So you wait for that data. Then once you receive it, you close the socket. You do something with the data if you want to do it, and then you close the socket. So that is your really simple, most simple client, right? You create the socket, you connect the socket, you send a request, you receive a response, and you close the socket. Now note that in a real client, like say it was a web client, you wouldn't immediately close the socket. Maybe you want to send more requests and get more responses, but this is generically what you might do. So we're going to go through this step by step, what the code might look like. We'll go through the beginning of it right now. So creating a socket, how might you do this? So here's some Python code that would do that. First, you import the socket. So you need to import the socket package, okay? The socket package has all these socket library functions in it, so you got to import that. So you start your code off with that. And then the next line is creating the socket. Now notice that this next line, for space reasons on the screen, we couldn't put it all on one line, but this wouldn't be on one long line, okay? So it wouldn't be broken up as two lines like that. MySock equals socket.socket, so on, so on, so on. So it's calling a function called socket.socket, okay? That function, that method really, creates a socket, okay? And so mysock, after I do this call, mysock is equal to the socket that I've just created. Now notice that this socket method, in this case, it's taking two arguments, okay? The first argument is socket.afinet. So AFINET declares the address family to be internet. That is always what we're going to be using because we're talking on the internet. Now there are other address families for other types of networks, but that by far the most common is going to be internet. Say I wanted to do, I don't know, infrared communication. There's an infrared address family and so on. Much less common, right? Vast majority of communication, we're going to use AFINET because we're using the internet. Also, the next argument, SockStream. SockStream indicates that we're using TCP, connection-based communication, as compared to UDP, right, which is connectionless. We're using TCP, and remember what TCP gives us. It's more overhead, but TCP gives us flow control. It gives us reliable communication. That's important. So we know that if we send a message, it will be received and won't get dropped mysteriously. Thank you.